Hey everyone, how are you doing today? This is Ann Lindsley and I am here to work with you today on AP Human Geography. And why don't we get started? Hope everyone's doing well. Have a nice day so far. And let's get loaded up here. And one more. There we go. So once again, yesterday you worked with my colleague Kristen Brandt from Illinois, and I am from Houston, Texas. It's a little bit warmer down here, but it is nice and green and feels good if you're tired of the snow. So today we are going to look at 6.3, Cities and Globalization. So just another reminder, if you weren't here with us on Monday or even on Tuesday, oh wait, no, Wednesday and Thursday, sorry, this is Friday. We mentioned to you that the reason for doing cities and globalization, or cities period, and then also 3 sections from development is because there are topics in these areas that reach back into units 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5. And so if you've already covered those and all of the innuendos that go with those other topics in those units, then you probably already picked up on some of this. But if you didn't make those links to it, then perhaps this would be a good chance to do that. If not, just use it as a review and look at the pretty pictures. We'll look at those. So let's begin with a warm up from yesterday. Ms. Brandt provided you with some questions. And so just to get you back into thinking about geography, let's look at some of these questions and think about how you answered them if you went ahead and answered them. In the very first one, identify the relationship between population and growth of megacities in less developed countries. So we have a spatial identification that works with economics as well, an LDC. And here we're looking at the relationship between the population growth and the growth of the megacity. So you want to think about a population that's at least 10 million, and why is it still growing? And then also, what are the stresses that are placed upon a city if it's in an LDC versus an MDC or a developing country? So hopefully you said that you will have stresses that it would include poverty issues, growth of squatter settlements, not that those are good at all, but challenges to the infrastructure, attempts to try to find work, but also the larger the city grows, the city is still going to continue attracting more and more population, particularly since that's where new types of jobs, manufacturing types of jobs tend to accumulate. All right, in the second question, how do cultural enclaves explain, catch that word there, explain, these are crucial words, explain how cultural enclaves develop in edge cities and suburbs. So what happens if you don't know what an edge city is and you don't know what a suburb is, because that's part of this unit, then topics that we're not going to be covering. You have explained how cultural enclaves develop someplace in a city. Okay, that's how we would take that apart. So what is a cultural enclave? You had that in the culture unit. And you also had the concept of enclaves in the political unit. So we've got 3 units represented here, and only one, the urban unit, is giving you the spatial location. So what is unique about this particular group that occupies this particular place? So that's what we're looking here. What happens, or how do they develop? And hopefully you thought about chain migration, because that would be part of that answer in that question. In the next one, explain why urban areas and nations on the periphery are growing at rapid rates. The periphery. Now, this is a term that you might have had in your political section. It's also in our developmental section, but it's also in our urban section. But on the periphery is just that, countries that are on the edge of the core developed countries. So why are urban areas in nations on the periphery growing at rapid rates? So taking that question apart, why do you have a concentration of population moving into urban areas in developing countries? Okay, sort of almost like the identify of the first question, but this is an explain. So since that's an explain, you have a few more sentences that need to be developed in here, and your answer needs to address more specifically why that population is concentrating in that urban area. All right, and the last one, describe how urbanization can impact a country's transition to stage 3 or 4 of the demographic transition model. So how does urbanization, increased growth of cities, bring a country to higher levels of development? So think about the demographic transition model. You had that in the population unit. Hopefully at that time you talked about a little bit about development that went along with it to pull those different stages along, and what happens, what does development look like in those kinds of countries at those stages. So why would you have a growth of urbanization here? Because you are pulling people from rural areas to urban areas, and development is allowing them to earn more money and ultimately feel more secure, financially secure, hopefully. And then that also has an impact on your birth rate. And but those cities become concentrations of employment for people in a rural to urban migration particularly. All right, so after looking at those, let's go on to 6.3. Look at this next section. In here we are looking at patterns in spatial organization, and our skill is actually dealing with scale analysis. Now this is a pretty big skill, but here in this particular area of scale analysis, as associated with 6.3, we're looking at the concepts and how these concepts explain spatial relations. All right, so 6.1, our objective 6.1. How do world cities function at the top of the world's urban hierarchy and drive globalization? So we're looking at urban hierarchy. We may not know what that is. Globalization, it's another factor. And we also need to answer, what is a world city? Okay. So let's start with some quick definitions, since you really aren't doing this as a full unit. You have most likely may have not addressed any vocabulary, depending upon what time you were in school and how far you were along. So just to make sure everyone has the same kind of information. What is an urban area? An urban area, as you can see, is a dense area of human settlement with an infrastructure of a built environment. So you have roads, and you have waste treatment facilities, you have trash pickup, you have different types of housing, you have different types of green space, you have different kinds of areas of the city with different types of functionality. That's an urban area. It's a denser area of human settlement. Okay. Urban hierarchy. So this is a hierarchy. So that means it's a rank order. And by hierarchy, we're looking at cities where cities tend to grow very large, and that's relative to smaller cities. But the judgment here is based upon at a national scale, because what is a metropolitan area is defined by governments and what sizes those need to be. But what ends up happening is we look at a national and a global scale based upon these statistical information. So some things that we kind of have to keep in mind here is that it's a system of cities where some will grow very large, but there is no perfect size of the city. And these cities are all functioning as part of an interconnected network, which creates further growth, shifts growth, moves businesses around, moves market areas around because of their relationships. So if you were to go on to the next objective in the next topic area in this unit, you actually would be looking at the theoretical approach that's part of urban hierarchy, and that's Kristall's central place theory. But we're not going on to that. But I just want to make sure that you realize that this is an urban hierarchies dealing with this interconnected network of different size cities and how those cities are influencing each other. But we have to take this, in order to work with 6.3, we have to take this to a global scale. So that drops off some of our smaller areas. Anyway, let's go on. The next one is a primate city. Now, primate city is further down in our different topic areas, but I'm just mentioning it here because a lot of our global cities actually are primate cities. So if I use that word primate city, we kind of needed to know what it was. So a primate city is a city that has a significantly larger population than other smaller cities. Obviously, they're going to be smaller, other cities in a country. Typically, also, the primate city is the economic and cultural, political center of a country with a very strong central government. That's not always going to have to be the case, but in a lot of cases it is. But you have this very, very large concentration, disproportionate size of the population that also is where your national ballet may be, your large Fortune 500 companies or transnational companies. It may also be the political or the judicial center for your country. So to give you an example, because historically, some of our primate cities today developed because that was the only city 600, 700, 800 years ago. So Paris, London, Tokyo, those are primate cities, okay? All right, so we got that, just kind of keep that in mind. Now, the next one is term I want you to be familiar with is the concept of globalization. And we have to kind of step aside here. You can read that or listen to me either way. But the thing about globalization is that it is one of the overarching themes in this entire course. There are aspects of globalization in the population unit. How does globalization affect population? How does it make us a more connected world? Globalization is definitely part of political negotiations between governments. Globalization is what changed our agriculture. So we can say this word globalization and not have a clue what we mean by it, but let's look at at a definition of it. And this is a good working definition, absolutely. And I'm going to give you another one. By the way, if you're interested in globalization topics, I'm not endorsing anyone, but globalization101.org is an excellent website with all kinds of different types of application to globalization stories and stuff like that. So it's excellent if you've never seen it. So globalization is a process. So that's the first thing. It's a process of interaction and integration among people and companies and governments and nations centered around international trade, international cooperation, investment, information technology. It is an attempt to make a very large, distant world much, much closer together through mutual cooperation, hopefully, and mutual trade, access to certain resources for development purposes. Anyway, so the other thing about globalization to keep in mind is the effect of globalization. And so it has positive and negative effects on other topics that we've already had. For example, what has globalization done to culture? Think about your family's culture. Can you see what has happened if you live in a big city? Do you still do all the traditional practices that maybe your great grandparents did or your grandparents? Is that even possible in if you live in a big city? Or has it just changed over the generations? And, you know, as a student, you think, okay, well, that's kind of lame. I'm not going to do that. We all go through that, even us that are older. So, but globalization is one of the factors that has changed cultures, but it also has enriched cultures and exposed you to other cultures. Because kind of think about it. Did you ever if you eat sushi, are you Japanese? Okay, can you go to the local sushi place and get some more? Well, maybe you can't get it right now, but can you get sushi and experience traditional Japanese culture? If you're getting the right stuff in it, you can. All right, so globalization also affects political systems and trade and negotiations and mutual agreements, different types of free trade agreements, different types of tariffs, and all kinds of things. You can listen to the news all the time and hear it, maybe not right now, but after we're done with this current issue of diffusion. All right, did you like how that geography worked there? All right, so also globalization works with economic development and prosperity. We have places that have become very wealthy as a place, high standard of living, and also very expensive to live in because of the effect that globalization has had on them, because those places became major trade locations, and it has a domino effect. So economics is brought into this as well. However, the part that a lot of people leave off is the aspect of the human beings. Your globalization indices that we're going to look at here in a second, those indices also address, is this place livable? Is this a good place to live? How do people like it? You may have heard about the happiest place to live, that kind of concept. So globalization, with all of the political and economic drivers to that, also has a factor of human capital. And is this a good place for humans to continue functioning in? Okay, so we have this very broad definition, which has some very specific parts. And you can walk through our entire course with this topic of globalization. And that's what I mean by an overarching theme. You should be able to, in your mind, by the time we get closer to May, be able to take that word and say, okay, I can pick it here, I can pick it there, I can pick it there. So here's a challenge to you. Ms. Brandt and I are going to be covering all of this course for you and going through review stuff as well. There's going to be some other overarching themes. So right now, put that in the back of your head and think about some of those things that you've heard about multiple times from your teacher that, I had that in that unit and that in that unit. So maybe you're probably right. That is an overarching theme. So we want to make sure we think about those. So let's go on. So I want to go through a couple of things here that show you aspects of how we look at global cities that then began to create this rise of these cities and the connections that these cities provide. So once again, we saw a similar graph to this or chart to this. I'm sure Ms. Brandt covered it yesterday as well. But if we look at the change over time, 1950, 2015, the largest cities, and then 2030, the largest cities. Notice, does anyone see the pattern out there? How things have changed from 1950 to 2030. Think about where some of these places are located. Notice that in 1950, you only had one of the cities that was in China. And in 2030, you're now up to two, but you have four cities in South Asia, and Mexico City is in there. Think about this. Are any of those cities surprising? If you are working with your teacher at all while the time period that we're out, you should ask your teacher if there's if anything's a surprise to you in these. What kind of pattern do we see here? What happened to London and Paris and Moscow? Think about that. Think about what happened to Moscow, because that's in one of those units that we've already had. All right. So if we look in the next slide here, we have where are the cities going to be by the time we get to 2035? And this is one of the indices. And in this index, it is looking at the GDP, population, and the growth of the GDP and looking at how these cities are going to become global or even increase as worldwide centers. So this is looking at economic data with also just population data, not so much quality of life or happy data. So it comes great in these charts and these maps. And so the maps, you cannot look at enough maps. Maps are a wealth of data, lots of fun. So in this very first one here, this is looking at the top 10 cities by projected GDP. Now, keep in mind, cities are the engine of the modern economy. That means that not only do over half of the world's population now live in urban areas, but those cities, those main cities, are also driving our global economy, and they are driving our global economy in ways that we have yet to even become to measure. And we're seeing the effect of some of that right now with the pandemic disease, but you'll see it in some areas. And so it's kind of interesting to kind of pay attention how all of this will play out, and then eventually how these cities will begin to start to recover. But if we look at the top 10 cities by GDP, you see New York, $2.5 trillion is supposed to be the GDP of New York City by 2035, staggering amount. Notice also Los Angeles and London are in there. Paris, some of the older cities are in there, but pretty much all the United States, traditional Western Europe, and then also China, your coastal edge of China, as well as Beijing. If we look over here at population, top 10 cities by their future population. Now in here, Jakarta is expected to be the largest city by 2035, Jakarta, Indonesia, the capital. However, you'll see others that will put Tokyo as the highest. Those that put Tokyo at the highest are actually looking at the influence of the environment affecting Jakarta. And Jakarta is sinking, the sea level is rising, and that is some forecasters and demographers are estimating that that's going to cause an economic development problem for Jakarta, which is why this particular indices did not put Jakarta up there at the very top. But what is also interesting is to look at Kinshasa and Lagos. Do you know where those are? I'm going to let you look those up. You need to know, well, you can look on the map there, or on the list of the countries. So Kinshasa and Lagos are already among the world's largest mega cities, home to over 10 million people. But they also are challenged with infrastructure issues, but they are rising fast, not just in terms of population, but also in manufacturing capabilities. But there are other issues that attribute to quality of life issues in those particular areas. All right, so notice that top 10 cities by future population, Mexico City is the only one in the Western Hemisphere on there. So question is, think about this. Why is that happening? Why is there such a large population growth in those top 10 cities where they are located? Are those developing countries? Are they developing countries? Are they on the coast? Are they interior? What kind of patterns? I talked about patterns on the very first day. What kind of patterns do you see about those places? All right, the next one is dealing with the growth of the GDP, estimated growth. And that's not Tokyo, and that's not Jakarta up there. That's Bangalore, India. Why is Bangalore? What is it about that place? Anyone cover anything about that in looking at things? Why would Bangalore end up being up at the very top on estimated GDP growth? So much so that its expected annual growth is 8.5%. To give you an average annual GDP growth across cities is usually about 2.6%. So these cities are all surpassing that more than twice. So that's something to think about. Here we have 4 cities in India, and we also have we have several Shenzhen and Tianjin, Shanghai, and Chongqing in China. So what is it about those cities? I was in Shenzhen. I'll show you some pictures from there. It's very different. It's not what you would expect. But what is happening in those particular places? But what's happening in Bangalore? I better have some students who can answer that. All right, so we look at this. We also see Shanghai is in there, and Shanghai is the commercial capital. It's one of the world's busiest ports. So does location play a role in the future GDP growth of these places? Think about that, okay? So we have another index. Once again, you do not have to know the names of these indices. They're different types of data that are used to look at global cities. And that's the only reason I want you to think about what are the factors that are going in to rate these cities. And I'm not even giving you all of those factors such that you see how these cities move around based upon what they have in them. Now, this is the Kearney Global Cities Index. This is always a fun one to look at because this one pulls in technology. So the exchange of information, where's my mouse? The exchange of information. It also pulls in human capital. So this is not just population, but this is also attributes of the population, types of businesses, but cultural. Do people want to live here? Are there cultural things to do? And so this has all of our units: economics, population, culture, and government. The only thing it doesn't have is agriculture, but you can't get here if you don't have agriculture already. So kind of think about that. I love this index. And unfortunately, my kids aren't going to get it because we're going to be doing it this way. So pay attention. All right, so in this one, New York, London, and Paris still maintain over a decades-long dominance up here at the top of this. And those actually, the top 4 cities have been in the top of this easily over a decade. They keep flipping around between 1, 2, 3, and 4-ish, 5-ish sometimes. But they flip around because part of this measurement is based upon this cultural experience, and that's tourism. So you have your service industry, and that's going to relate to something I have to talk about on Monday. But this relates to your service industries as well as your quaternary, tertiary, quaternary levels of the economies. And so that's all plays a role in creating this index and looking at those global cities. Another interesting one is from the Swiss, and this is an economic, social, and political index. And this comes from the Swiss Economic Institute. And isn't that interesting? They rated themselves #1. I personally think they're #1, but that's okay. Those of you who know me know why. But anyway, in here, they actually are looking at countries, but you got to keep in mind, it's the cities in these countries that are going to pull this globalization index. And in this particular one, they are defining globalization as the process of creating, listen to this, process of creating networks of connections among actors at multi-continental distances, mediated through a variety of flows, including people, information, ideas, capitals, and goods. So they pretty much, their index literally walks through the objective for this particular topic. Creating networks of connections between multi-continental distances. So if you look at the top countries that they have, if you notice, you should pretty much notice, look at this. We go all the way down to number 20 before we get a country outside of, is that right? Yeah, before we get to a country outside of Europe. Okay. It has to do with the connections, and that is why this number is like it is. Anyway, look at the World Economic Forum. This is always a fun source. If any of the teachers out there are listening, if you've never used the World Economic Forum materials, they're great. It's all data, and they have great maps and great videos, and the videos are a little bit too long to put on here, but they have excellent stuff that you should consider adopting into your classroom to help support this material. So they use what is called the magnetic index, and this is an index that they kind of created themselves, but the Global Power Cities Index is looking at the power to attract creative people and businesses from across the globe. And they want to mobilize their assets to boost economic, social, and environmental development. So they're looking at the role of the environment as well as the social area in order to bring and attract minds and better attract human capital. We can put it all into that. And so in this particular one, London, New York, Tokyo, Paris, and Singapore are your top 5. I don't know if you can read the white that's in that graph. It's kind of hard. But anyway, so we start to see a common thread. Tokyo, Hong Kong, Singapore, London, New York. We see a common thread. Those are your global cities, okay? Not exclusively, a lot of different cities, don't everyone get upset. There's a lot of different cities that have different roles in how you're looking at this place as a global city, okay? There's even a whole ranking system of alpha, double plus, alpha, and then beta and gamma to also rank cities. But they're using a little bit different criteria for doing it. So basically, is to keep you need to think about what is involved in looking at what makes a megacity and what makes a global city. So once again, I was reading the title. So once again, megacities. The megacities, as Ms. Brandt went through yesterday with you, the breakdown of countries in their regions with the current megacities that they have. Many of these megacities today are also global cities, okay? Now, We have Tehran in here. Do you know Tehran? Tehran is in, you guessed it, Iran. Great. Is Tehran a global city? Think about that. Have a discussion in class when you go back. Is Tehran a global city? It may not be a global city from the US perspective or from some other perspectives, but is Tehran a global city to any other countries at all? You have to have that connectivity, but Tehran is a megacity. So we kind of have to be careful. We can't say all megacities are also global cities, and we can't say that all global cities are megacities, although many of them are. All right, deep breath. Okay, so let's look at part 2 of this topic, 6.3. And in 6B2, we're looking at how cities are connected globally by networks and linkages to create these or mediate global processes. Okay, so all right, so we look at world cities. Go forward, come on. Levels of scale. When we look at world cities, we can look at them at different levels of scale. So what we have to think of is that you have this world economy, and it's at the top level scale. We could call that a supranodal network. So it's connecting all of these cities together. And you think of cities as a node. And inside of those cities, you have various economic firms and activities, functions that are happening at the subnodal level. So subnodal is the businesses, the cities become the nodes, and then the network is the supranodal, which is really nicely illustrated in this graphic image here for you. All right, so all of these supranodal areas are connected to the networks, which are then linking all these cities together. This is what is creating this global economic network between these large cities. So there's a few of them, or a couple of them actually, that are part of this world network that we should probably have a little bit of familiarity with without a whole lot of detail. So the first one here is this region of Hong Kong and Shenzhen in southern China, area of Guangzhou. So those pictures really are not bad pictures. I took those pictures. College Board actually sent me to Shenzhen and to train some teachers. I hope one of them is listening because she contacted me the other day. Anyway, that's the pollution. So you're looking at Hong Kong and the bridge connecting to Shenzhen. But this is a major technological corridor that they are creating to bring Hong Kong, an island, closer into the southern China economic zone in that area, creating a high-speed transportation corridor and communication infrastructure, facilitating cooperation between the two areas. It's a very rapidly growing economic hub, such that when you are in the area of Shenzhen, the whole area doesn't look like what you would think portions of traditional China would look like. Lots of high-rise buildings like this, and all very, very modern. Then from there, the second largest of this network is actually one that's being developed in Japan. And this is the Kyoto, Osaka, Kobe corridor from Kyoto to Osaka. And it's rivaling Tokyo, Yokohama. So this particular corridor here is looking at commercial and industrial businesses to connect the world between high-speed information, but then connecting everyone else through high-speed rail, moving goods and people much more faster and efficiently. So we look at this as part of how cities are expanding and accommodating large populations, economic growth, and that connectivity with the rest of the world. The other area that really has this network working is in Europe, the area around Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Amsterdam, The Hague, Delft, and Utrecht and Zaanstad. This area of Randstad includes one of the largest ports in the world, which is the port of Rotterdam. But this whole region here is designed to create an entrance into connecting Europe with the rest of the world as well. And And once again, high-speed rail is part of this whole plan in this region. And it's the exporting of goods. Now, there's no similar network in the United States because we are not linking our major cities, our conurbations, our continuous urban areas, or our megalopolis to other regions. We would need to be linking the Boswash corridor, Boston to Washington, D.C., or to Chicago, or Chicago down to Dallas. We would be needing to make the commitment to put in that industrial complex to and high-speed rail to move goods and services, but we don't. So the United States doesn't have this type of connectivity between its global cities. All right, so this is an interesting map on global cities themselves of how you start to see these patterns of linking together. And this is actually linking by different sizes. I encourage you to pull it up, go and pull up this map because it's really kind of cool, because you can begin to look at the different colors of the different sizes that are linked together. So your biggest cities tend to be linked to your other global cities, and some of your secondary, tertiary cities are linking themselves together in this global network. Now, what is this global network? It's connections that are made by air, by land, and by water. Really, it is. It's kind of interesting to see it. Our connections made by air are made by flights. This is interesting to see how these connections are made. So our air flights over a 24-hour period. This is actually 17 hours and 13 seconds. And so what you see, the cloud going over is actually nighttime, and you see the decrease in air traffic at night, obviously. But I think what's fascinating is to continue looking at these patterns, these flight patterns. Of course, they're flying in these patterns because those are the shortest routes due to the curvature of the Earth. But still, you see this explosion over here in those patterns, and you see that the areas that are not connected. That's one of the things that's interesting to see is what are we not connecting to? Okay, so you see a stagnant picture image of it. Now, these are very special maps that were made for you because my son happens to be sitting in the other room doing his college classes, and he is a minor in GIS. And so he found these and was editing them for this presentation. So these are personal maps made just for y'all. So we're looking at this static image of these global air connections. All right, notice, obviously, this is going to be the curvature, but look at this heavy concentration, heavy concentration, heavy concentration. So we are connecting these regions and these cities, which continue to contribute to their growth. You see it in a smaller end like this. We also can connect by water, and that's obviously the movement of cargo. Another absolutely fabulous website is called ourworldindata.org. They have a great interactive video that goes along with this. But these are shipping routes. Now, granted, they have to go around land masses, but you begin to get specific places where these are all going to, even though they're going around, the tip of South of Africa. But look at these routes, specific routes. These routes are connecting these these global cities. If we look at connection by land, we're looking at internet connections. How are we connecting ourselves to other places in the world? How are these global cities? Now, there's one problem with this particularly choropleth map. It's one of my major pet peeves. My students better be yelling it right now because they've colored the whole country, not just the city. And that distorts what our data is that we really want to see. But we still get this perspective that those global cities in those countries are going to have a high degree of connectivity to other places in the world. And one of those is facilitated by fiber optics. And these are submarine cables that have been built since I started teaching this course. It's real short. So you start to see the connection across the Atlantic, through the Mediterranean, going specifically, obviously, to the coastal edges, but where those points are your global cities. Making us a very connected world. These are just closer to right, so these global cities have now contributed to what we call mega regions. Remember in Unit 1, you should have covered the concept of regions. Well, now we're looking at beginning economically with mega regions, and mega regions are economic designs based upon GDP, productivity, and population. So the concept of, or the word mega regions is not something we're going to see, but what happens if once we get larger populations and your global city begins to stretch further and further into more peripheral edges, pulling in more edge cities, you're creating a mega region out of those particular global cities. Okay. So what did we quickly cover? We covered the concept of the urban hierarchy, the drive toward globalization. We looked at the networks that bring these places together and want to think about it by, if not by air, by land, by water concept. And what are these? These are linkages of increased technology that allows for increased productivity, increased economic output, which then pulls us together as a global world. And of course, there are going to be consequences to that. I'll leave you to think about some of those. Where are connections into our other units? Agriculture. We couldn't have done any of this if we hadn't had a sedentary form of agriculture that then began to shift. Think about that. We look at the scale of analysis, global, regional, local effects from having global cities, spatial networks. Cultural ideas are social constructs that change as a result of globalization. All right, so I have a couple of questions for you to practice. Okay, how does globalization change traditional cultures? Probably should have talked about that in Unit 3. Global trade networks have shifted agriculture to extensive commercial operations. Explain how. Explain why would be a good question too. Explain how global cities attract more international migrants than smaller places. Migration, Unit 2. And then compare the impact of global trade networks on the labor market. Who is coming? Also be a factor of migration. Just some things to think about. And I keep really stressing blending these topics back. Globalization, which leads to global cities, is an overarching theme in this course. Okay, so last thing to remind you, College Board would like us to remind you is that if you do not directly, if you're having troubles with technology and you need to have a working solution, College Board is there to try to help you. And they would need for you to reach out directly to them at cb.org/tech. And thank you all for watching. I hope you picked up on a few things. If any of my students are watching, hi, and glad to see you. And I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see y'all on Monday for topics in development. All right, have a great weekend. Bye-bye.